Throughout the early 1800s, only a very few immigrants were from Asia. But from 1860 to 1880, nearly 200,000 Chinese and Japanese laborers arrived in the West. They had heard the news of the discovery of gold in California, and they wanted to take part in the American dream. Most found jobs building the railroads, such as the Central Pacific Railroad, which were uniting the country and which were so important in the early development of America. But prejudice and fears about an Asian menace helped close the gates to most Asians. Some said Asians were willing to work long hours at very low pay and therefore were taking jobs away from white Americans. Popular prejudices about Chinese immigrants led many to view these newcomers as immoral, dangerous, and addicted to drugs. Sometimes American workers even used violence to scare and intimidate Asian immigrants. In 1902, Congress passed the Oriental Exclusion Act. It stopped most immigration from the Far East. Immigration to the U.S. was fairly open until the beginning of the 20th century. Between 1900 and 1910, nearly 9 million people immigrated to America. Many Americans began to fear that this flood of immigrants was changing what they saw as the basic character of our country. In this cartoon, a European and an Asian immigrant are swallowing Uncle Sam, who stands for the American way of life. Many Americans held deep prejudices against these immigrants. These prejudices formed in large part because the new arrivals were seen as different. Immigrants did indeed bring with them customs and religious practices that differed greatly from those of the Northern Europeans who had settled here earlier. Because of this, many Americans ridiculed the new immigrants and spread unfair stereotypes that portrayed them as foolish, strangely dressed, dishonest, or unintelligent. Many citizens began calling for new laws that would limit immigration. The message to many immigrants seemed to be, "Stay away." In response to these complaints, the United States began to place more limits on immigration. Congress passed several laws in the 1920s that made it much harder for immigrants to come here. The National Origins Act of 1924 established an immigration quota, or limit, for each country outside the Western Hemisphere. This law was followed by another in 1929. It allowed a total of only about 150,000 immigrants a year to enter the United States from all these countries combined. Each national group's quota of that 150,000 depended on the number of people in that group already in America. This law was unfair because it favored the kinds of people who were already here and denied an equal opportunity to people from other countries. Since groups from Northern Europe made up by far the largest share of Americans, their quotas were also by far the largest. About 3 out of every 4 immigrants after 1929 were from Northern Europe. Only 3 out of every 100 immigrants after 1929 were from Asia, where a huge share of the world's people live. And these non-Europeans were often mistreated even after they arrived here. During World War II, thousands of Japanese Americans were forced from their homes and held in relocation centers, camps that were actually more like prisons. There was no reason to think these people would be disloyal during the war. But many Americans were so angry with Japan for attacking our country and so suspicious of all Asian immigrants that they used the war as an excuse to punish these Japanese Americans. After World War II, Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy all tried to end the unfair system of national quotas for immigrants. But for the most part, Congress refused to go along. Finally, President Lyndon Johnson succeeded in getting Congress to pass the Immigration Act of 1965. This new law helped win fairer treatment for those who wished to immigrate to America. It ended quotas for single nations. Instead, It set an overall limit of 290,000 immigrants, 170,000 from the Eastern Hemisphere and 120,000 from the Western Hemisphere. The Act established a system favoring those with higher educations or special skills, and those with close relatives living here, such as husbands, wives, or parents, could enter without being counted as part of the total limit.